Sarah Martinez arrived at Fort Davidson Military Academy on a Tuesday morning in September with nothing but a duffel bag and a scholarship letter that had saved her from a life she desperately wanted to escape. The letter was wrinkled from being read so many times, and she kept it folded in her back pocket like a talisman. At 19, she was older than most incoming cadets, but her late start hadn't been by choice. She had spent 2 years working double shifts at a factory in East Los Angeles, saving every penny to make this dream possible. The academy sprawled across 200 acres of pristine Virginia countryside, its red brick buildings and manicured lawns a stark contrast to the concrete and graffiti of her neighborhood back home. As she walked through the iron gates for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of generations of military tradition pressing down on her shoulders. Bronze plaques commemorated graduates who had become generals, senators, and heroes. She wondered if there would ever be a place for someone like her among those distinguished names. Her roommate was Rebecca Thornton, a blonde girl from Connecticut whose father was a 3-star general and whose grandfather had graduated from West Point in 1943. Rebecca's side of the room was already perfectly arranged with family photos, expensive textbooks, and a small American flag that had been folded by her father himself. Sarah's side remained sparse, a few changes of clothes, some worn paperbacks, and a photo of her mother taken before the cancer had stolen the light from her eyes. The first few days passed in a blur of orientation sessions, uniform fittings, and endless paperwork. Sarah kept her head down and tried to blend into the background, a skill she had perfected during her years in foster care. She learned quickly that the academy operated on an intricate social hierarchy that had nothing to do with official rank. The students whose families had military pedigrees formed an invisible elite, while scholarship students like herself were tolerated but never truly accepted. It was during her first combat training session that Sarah began to understand just how different her background was from her classmates. While they had spent their teenage years at private schools and country clubs, she had been learning to survive in an environment where weakness meant becoming prey. Her foster brother Miguel had taught her to fight in the underground clubs that operated in the warehouse district, places where desperate people bet their last dollars on brutal matches that lasted until someone couldn't get back up. Miguel had been more than just a teacher, he had been her protector in a system that had failed them both. He showed her that fighting wasn't about anger or hatred, but about calculation and control. He taught her to read her opponent's weaknesses, to use their strength against them, and, most importantly, to never reveal her true capabilities until the moment she needed them most. Those lessons had kept her alive in group homes where bullying was constant and supervision was minimal. But, at Fort Davidson, Sarah kept those skills buried deep. During hand-to-hand combat training, she deliberately held back, allowing herself to be thrown and pinned by classmates who assumed her small stature meant weakness. She absorbed their condescending advice about proper technique and thanked them politely, all while knowing she could have ended any of those matches within seconds. The deception wasn't easy, every instinct she had developed over years of real fighting screamed at her to defend herself properly, but she understood that revealing her true abilities would only create more problems. The hazing began during her second week. It started small, her boots would go missing before inspection, or someone would pour salt in her water bottle during long marches. Sarah endured it all without complaint, understanding that reacting would only escalate the situation. She had learned long ago that bullies fed on emotional responses, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. Sergeant Bradley Hawkins seemed to take particular pleasure in making her life difficult. He was a compact man in his early 30s with close-cropped hair and eyes that held no warmth. He had grown up in military families and couldn't understand why someone like Sarah had been given a spot that could have gone to someone more deserving, someone whose family had served for generations. During drills, he would single her out for criticism, making her repeat exercises until exhaustion forced her to stumble. When she completed them perfectly, he would find new ways to demean her effort. The other cadets learned to follow his lead. If Sergeant Hawkins thought Sarah didn't belong, then clearly she didn't belong. They began excluding her from study groups and social gatherings. Conversations would stop when she entered a room, and she would catch them staring at her with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust. The isolation was perhaps more difficult than the active harassment, but Sarah had survived worse. She had spent years as an outsider, and she knew how to function in solitude. Her academic performance remained excellent despite the social obstacles. Sarah had always been a gifted student, and she threw herself into her coursework with the same determination that had gotten her out of the foster system. She studied military history, tactical analysis, and leadership theory with an intensity that impressed even her harshest critics. But academic excellence only seemed to increase the resentment toward her. How dare this scholarship student outperform the children of career military families? The psychological warfare intensified as autumn progressed. Someone would loosen the straps on her pack before long marches, causing her to fall behind when her equipment scattered across the trail. Her personal items would be moved or hidden, forcing her to arrive late to formation while searching for essential gear. During group exercises, her teammates would deliberately miscommunicate, leaving her isolated and unable to complete assigned objectives. Sarah documented every incident in a small notebook she kept hidden in her mattress. She recorded dates, times, witnesses, and detailed descriptions of each act of harassment. Her mother had taught her to keep records, a lesson learned during years of dealing with social workers and court officials who often ignored or dismissed their concerns. Sarah knew that if things escalated beyond her ability to endure, she would need evidence that no one could dispute. But, as the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to wonder if she was fighting a losing battle. The isolation was wearing her down in ways that physical harassment never could. She started questioning whether she really belonged at the academy, whether her mother's dream for her daughter's future had been nothing more than wishful thinking. Maybe everyone was right, maybe she should return to Los Angeles and accept the limitations that her background had placed on her life. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal training exercise in November. Sarah's unit was practicing urban combat scenarios in a mock village built for training purposes. The exercise required split-second decision-making and perfect coordination between team members. Sarah had studied the tactical manual extensively and understood exactly what needed to be done, but her teammates continued their pattern of excluding her from planning sessions and withholding crucial information. When the exercise began, Sarah found herself isolated and uninformed while her unit moved through the mock buildings around her. She could hear them communicating through their radios, but no one was sharing information with her position. As she tried to navigate the scenario alone, she realized that her teammates had deliberately set her up to fail in front of the evaluating officers. The humiliation was complete when Sergeant Hawkins called an end to the exercise and gathered the unit for debriefing. He spent 20 minutes detailing Sarah's failures, describing how her incompetence had compromised the entire mission. The other cadets stood at attention, hiding smiles as their tormentor was systematically destroyed in front of their instructors. Sarah maintained her composure throughout the verbal assault, but, inside, something fundamental was beginning to crack. That night, alone in her room while Rebecca was at a social function that Sarah hadn't been invited to, she pulled out the wrinkled scholarship letter and read it one more time. The words that had once filled her with hope now seemed like lies designed to mock her presumption. Perhaps it was time to accept that some barriers couldn't be crossed, no matter how much determination and hard work she brought to the challenge. But, then, she remembered Miguel's voice during one of their training sessions in the warehouse district. He had been teaching her how to absorb punishment while waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, he had told her. They can break you down, but only if you let them. Remember who you really are under all that pain, and, when the moment comes, show them what fire looks like. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. She wasn't ready to surrender yet. But she also wasn't sure how much more she could endure before something inside her broke permanently. What she didn't know was that her real test was still ahead of her, and, when it came, it would reveal not just her own hidden strength, but the rottenness that lay beneath the academy's polished surface. Winter at Fort Davidson brought more than just cold weather, it brought an escalation in the systematic campaign to break Sarah's spirit. The academy's heating system was old and inconsistent, and somehow Sarah's dormitory room always seemed to be the coldest in the building. She would wake up shivering under thin military-issued blankets, her breath visible in the frigid air, while other rooms remained comfortably warm. When she reported the problem to maintenance, they would promise to investigate, but no repairs were ever made. The dining hall became another battlefield. Sarah's assigned seat was always at the end of tables where conversations died the moment she sat down. Cadets would save seats for their friends but somehow never have room for her, forcing her to eat alone while surrounded by the laughter and camaraderie she was systematically excluded from. Sometimes her meal tray would be accidentally knocked from her hands as she tried to find a place to sit, sending food scattering across the floor while dozens of witnesses pretended not to notice. Physical training sessions grew increasingly dangerous. During obstacle course runs, ropes would be loosened just enough to make climbing treacherous. Safety equipment would malfunction when she used it, forcing her to restart exercises while others completed their requirements and moved on to other activities. Sergeant Hawkins would watch these incidents with satisfaction, making comments about how some people weren't cut out for military life. Sarah's academic excellence continued to shine through despite the mounting pressures. She topped her classes in military strategy, weapons systems, and leadership theory. Her written analyses of historical battles impressed professors who had taught at the academy for decades. But success in the classroom only intensified the resentment she faced everywhere else. How dare this outsider outperform students whose families had been preparing them for military careers since childhood? The psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication. Sarah's personal belongings would be rearranged in subtle ways that made her question her own memory. Her carefully maintained schedule would be disrupted when someone would give her false information about meeting times or location changes. She began triple-checking everything, developing habits that bordered on obsessive as she tried to maintain some control over her increasingly chaotic environment. Rebecca, her roommate, had initially tried to remain neutral in the conflict, but social pressure eventually won out over basic decency. She stopped making eye contact with Sarah and began spending all her time with other cadets who made it clear that associating with the scholarship student would damage their own social standing. The room that had once been Sarah's only refuge became another source of isolation as Rebecca treated her like an invisible presence to be ignored. Sarah's notebook of harassment incidents grew thicker with each passing week. She documented everything with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her an excellent student. Dates, times, witnesses, descriptions, she recorded it all in small, precise handwriting that filled page after page. The notebook became her confidant and her hope, evidence that someday someone with the power to create change might actually listen to her story. But reporting the harassment proved futile. When she finally gathered the courage to speak with a guidance counselor about the systematic campaign against her, she was told that military life was inherently difficult and that perhaps she needed to develop thicker skin. The counselor, a middle-aged woman who had spent her entire career at the academy, suggested that Sarah's problems might be caused by her own inability to integrate with her classmates rather than by any deliberate harassment. Academic advisors offered similar responses when Sarah tried to describe the obstacles she faced. They acknowledged her excellent grades but suggested that success required more than just classroom performance. Military leaders needed to be able to work effectively with their peers, they explained, and perhaps Sarah should focus on developing better social skills rather than dwelling on minor conflicts with other cadets. The administration's indifference was perhaps more crushing than the active harassment she received from students and some instructors. At least her tormentors were honest about their intentions, they wanted her gone and they weren't trying to hide it. But the officials who were supposed to protect all students chose to look the other way, treating her suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining institutional harmony. Winter gave way to spring, and, with the warmer weather came new forms of persecution. During outdoor training exercises, Sarah's equipment would be sabotaged in ways that created genuine danger. Her rappelling gear would be tampered with, her navigation compass would be deliberately damaged, and her communication equipment would mysteriously malfunction during critical moments. She began conducting her own safety inspections before every exercise, a practice that saved her from serious injury on multiple occasions. The other cadets had perfected the art of gaslighting, making Sarah question her own perceptions of reality. They would deny conversations that had happened in front of multiple witnesses, claim that incidents she clearly remembered had never occurred, and suggest that her stress was causing her to imagine persecution that didn't exist. The constant psychological manipulation began to take its toll, making Sarah doubt her own memory and judgment. Sleep became elusive as the harassment followed her into the night. Her room would be filled with strange odors from unknown sources, loud noises would wake her at random hours, and she would find evidence that someone had been in her space while she was away. The lack of rest affected her performance during physical training, giving her tormentors new ammunition for their campaign of humiliation. Sarah's health began to deteriorate under the constant stress. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her hands developed a slight tremor from anxiety, and her usually clear complexion broke out in stress-induced acne. Medical personnel attributed her symptoms to the normal pressures of military training and prescribed basic remedies that did nothing to address the underlying causes of her distress. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of her ordeal was the way it forced her to become someone she despised. Sarah found herself becoming hypervigilant and suspicious, analyzing every interaction for hidden threats and ulterior motives. The open, trusting girl who had arrived at the academy was being replaced by someone hardened and defensive, someone who saw enemies everywhere because enemies were everywhere. The fighting skills Miguel had taught her remained buried, but Sarah could feel them stirring beneath the surface as her situation grew more desperate. Sometimes, during particularly brutal harassment, she would catch herself calculating how quickly she could neutralize the threats around her. Her hands would clench into fists, and, for a moment, she would imagine the satisfaction of showing these privileged bullies what real violence looked like. But she always pulled back from that edge. Using her true abilities would only confirm what everyone already believed about her, that she was dangerous, uncontrolled, and unfit for the disciplined environment of a military academy. Sarah understood that her only hope for survival lay in maintaining the facade of helplessness that her tormentors expected from her. Spring training culminated in a major field exercise that would test everything the cadets had learned during their first year. The exercise would be evaluated by senior academy officials and would significantly impact their advancement to the second-year program. For most cadets, it represented an opportunity to prove themselves ready for increased responsibilities and leadership roles. For Sarah, it represented what might be her final chance to demonstrate that she belonged at the academy. The night before the exercise began, Sarah sat alone in her room reviewing tactical manuals and equipment checklists. Rebecca had gone to a pre-exercise party that Sarah hadn't been invited to, leaving her with the solitude she had grown accustomed to over the long months of isolation. As she prepared for what could be her last major test at Fort Davidson, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since arriving at the academy. The girl who had once dreamed of following in her mother's footsteps was now someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and analyzed every face for signs of hostility. The academy had taught her lessons that weren't in any curriculum, lessons about institutional cruelty, about the power of organized persecution, and about how good people could become complicit in evil through their silence and indifference. But it had also taught her something else, something that Miguel's training in the underground fighting circuits had only hinted at. She had learned that she could endure far more than she had ever imagined possible. Every day that she survived was a victory over people who wanted nothing more than to see her break and disappear. Her continued presence was itself an act of defiance that drove her tormentors to increasingly desperate measures. As she closed her textbooks and prepared for sleep, Sarah made a promise to herself. Whatever happened during the field exercise, she would not give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her quit. She would complete the program or die trying, and if they wanted her gone, they would have to find a way to officially remove her rather than simply hoping that harassment would drive her away. What Sarah didn't know was that her tormentors had already decided that the field exercise would provide the perfect opportunity to end her time at the academy once and for all. They had developed a plan that would humiliate her so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to withdraw from the program. But they had made a critical error in their calculations. They had never bothered to learn who Sarah really was beneath the facade she had maintained for 8 long months. The morning of the exercise dawned clear and cold, with a hint of frost on the grass outside the dormitory windows. As Sarah prepared her gear for what would become the most important day of her life, she had no idea that she was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to defend herself, and what price she would pay for finally showing the world her true strength. The field exercise began at dawn with 200 cadets assembling in full combat gear on the academy's sprawling training grounds. Sarah stood in formation with her assigned unit, her equipment meticulously checked and double-checked after months of learning not to trust anything to chance. The morning air was crisp and filled with nervous energy as cadets prepared for their most challenging test yet, a 3-day simulation that would determine their advancement to the next level of training. Colonel Harrison, the Academy's commanding officer, addressed the assembled cadets from a raised platform overlooking the formation. He was an imposing man in his 50s whose chest displayed ribbons from 2 decades of active duty service. His voice carried easily across the silent ranks as he outlined the exercise parameters, emphasizing that this evaluation would separate those truly committed to military excellence from those who merely thought they wanted a military career. Sarah listened intently as the colonel described the scenario, a complex urban warfare simulation that would test tactical decision-making, leadership under pressure, and the ability to function effectively as part of a coordinated team. Units would be evaluated not just on their success in completing objectives, but on how they adapted to unexpected challenges and supported their teammates under stress. The exercise would push every cadet to their absolute limits, both physically and mentally. But Sarah had already noticed something that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Her assigned position within her unit was deliberately isolated, designed to make coordination with her teammates difficult if not impossible. She had been designated as a communications specialist but, given equipment that she could already see had been tampered with. The radio's antenna was slightly bent, the battery pack showed signs of having been opened, and the headset wires had been subtly damaged in a way that would cause intermittent failures at crucial moments. Sergeant Hawkins moved through the formation with practiced efficiency, inspecting equipment and making final adjustments to unit compositions. When he reached Sarah's position, his inspection was particularly thorough, examining every piece of her gear with an intensity that bordered on harassment. He found fault with the angle of her pack straps, the positioning of her weapon, and the state of her boots, forcing her to make adjustments while other cadets watched with barely concealed amusement. The first phase of the exercise unfolded in heavily wooded terrain designed to simulate hostile territory. Sarah's unit moved through dense forest following predetermined routes while attempting to avoid detection by opposing forces played by advanced cadets and academy instructors. The exercise required constant communication between team members, but Sarah's sabotaged radio equipment made her an unreliable link in the communication chain from the very beginning. As her unit advanced through increasingly challenging terrain, Sarah found herself falling behind despite her excellent physical conditioning. Her teammates were receiving navigation updates and tactical information that wasn't reaching her due to her malfunctioning equipment. When she tried to communicate her position or report observations, her transmissions were either ignored or dismissed as unclear and unhelpful. The isolation she had endured for months was now being weaponized to destroy her performance during the most important evaluation of her academy career. By midday, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. Her unit had abandoned any pretense of including her in their tactical planning, treating her as deadweight to be tolerated rather than a team member to be supported. When she attempted to contribute observations or suggestions based on her extensive study of military tactics, she was curtly told to focus on her own responsibilities and stop trying to do other people's jobs. The psychological pressure intensified as the exercise progressed into more complex scenarios. Sarah's teammates began openly discussing their resentment at being saddled with someone who was clearly incompetent and unprepared for military service. They spoke as if she weren't there, detailing how her presence had compromised their unit's effectiveness and expressing hope that the evaluating officers would recognize that their poor performance was due to factors beyond their control. But Sarah had not survived months of systematic harassment by giving up when circumstances became difficult. She adapted to her equipment failures by developing alternative methods of navigation and communication. When her radio failed completely, she used hand signals and written messages to maintain contact with her unit. When her teammates withheld crucial information, she relied on her own tactical knowledge and observation skills to anticipate developing situations. Her resilience and adaptability began to attract notice from some of the evaluating officers who were monitoring the exercise from concealed observation points throughout the training area. Captain Morrison, a decorated veteran who served as one of the primary evaluators, found himself impressed by how one particular cadet was managing to function effectively despite obvious equipment problems and apparent lack of support from her teammates. He made notes in his evaluation report about resourcefulness under adverse conditions and the ability to maintain mission focus despite interpersonal difficulties. The evening brought new challenges as units transitioned to night operations in the mock urban environment. Sarah's performance during the daylight phases had been adequate despite the obstacles she faced, but her tormentors were determined that darkness would provide opportunities to escalate their campaign beyond anything she could endure. They had spent months planning this moment, and they intended to ensure that Sarah's humiliation would be so complete that she would have no choice but to withdraw from the academy. As units prepared for the night assault phase, Sergeant Hawkins gathered Sarah's teammates for what appeared to be a routine tactical briefing. But Sarah could see the expressions on their faces as they listened to his instructions, and she recognized the look of people who had been given permission to do something they had long wanted to do. The pretense of professional military training was about to be abandoned in favor of something far more personal and vicious. The night operation began with Sarah's unit advancing through darkened streets designed to simulate an urban combat environment. Buildings loomed on either side of narrow alleys filled with shadows and potential ambush points. The scenario required precise coordination and absolute trust between team members, but Sarah's teammates had already decided that the exercise would serve a different purpose entirely. It started when her team leader assigned her to investigate a supposedly cleared building alone while the rest of the unit continued toward their primary objective. The assignment violated basic tactical principles and safety protocols, but Sarah had no choice but to comply with direct orders from a superior cadet. As she entered the darkened structure, she could hear her teammates moving away through the streets outside, leaving her isolated and vulnerable in unfamiliar territory. The building was a maze of corridors and empty rooms designed to disorient advancing forces. Sarah moved carefully through the darkness, using night vision equipment that had been deliberately damaged to reduce its effectiveness. She could hear sounds that suggested the presence of opposing forces, but her malfunctioning communication gear made it impossible to request backup or report her situation to the rest of her unit. When the attack came, it was swift and overwhelming. 3 figures emerged from concealed positions and overpowered her before she could react effectively. But, instead of applying the standard restraints used in training exercises, they began what could only be described as a systematic assault designed to inflict maximum humiliation rather than simulate military capture. Sarah realized with horror that this wasn't part of the official exercise, this was the culmination of months of planning by people who wanted to destroy her completely. They dragged her outside into a courtyard where other members of her unit were waiting with Sergeant Hawkins observing from a position that gave him plausible deniability about what was happening. The attack escalated beyond anything that could be justified as training as they forced her to the ground and began systematically destroying her equipment and personal dignity. Sarah could hear them discussing how they planned to claim that her poor performance and emotional breakdown had made her unfit for military service. For 8 months, Sarah had endured harassment, isolation, and systematic persecution without striking back. She had absorbed physical and psychological abuse while maintaining the facade of helplessness that her tormentors expected. But, as she lay in the dirt with her attackers celebrating their victory over her, something fundamental shifted inside her mind. The careful control she had maintained for so long began to crack, and the fighter that Miguel had trained began to emerge from beneath layers of forced submission. The transformation started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Sarah's breathing changed from panicked gasps to the controlled rhythm that Miguel had taught her during their sessions in the warehouse district. Her muscles shifted from defensive tension to the relaxed readiness of someone who had learned to channel violence with surgical precision. The girl who had spent months being victimized was disappearing, replaced by someone whose very presence radiated lethal capability. Sergeant Hawkins noticed the change first. Something in Sarah's posture triggered instincts developed during years of combat experience, warning him that the situation was about to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. He moved closer to intervene, perhaps sensing that his carefully orchestrated humiliation was about to become something far more dangerous. But he was already too late to prevent what his own cruelty had set in motion. Sarah's eyes opened and focused on her primary attacker with an intensity that made him step backward involuntarily. The helpless victim he expected to see was gone, replaced by someone who looked at him with the cold calculation of a predator sizing out prey. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the deference and submission that her tormentors had grown accustomed to hearing from her. "Get away from me," she said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone in the courtyard freeze. The girl they had been tormenting for months had vanished, and, in her place was someone they didn't recognize, someone whose very presence suggested that they had made a terrible mistake in judgment. What happened next would shatter every assumption they had made about Sarah Martinez and reveal the true cost of pushing someone beyond their breaking point. The silence in the courtyard stretched for several heartbeats as Sarah rose from the ground with fluid grace that seemed impossible given the violence she had just endured. Her movements carried none of the awkward uncertainty that her tormentors had grown accustomed to seeing from her during months of systematic harassment. Instead, she moved with the predatory confidence of someone who had been hiding their true nature behind a carefully constructed facade of weakness. Cadet Marcus Thompson, the ringleader of her attackers, laughed nervously as he watched her stand. He was a large young man who had used his size and family connections to dominate weaker students since arriving at the academy. His father was a career Marine, and Marcus had never encountered a situation where intimidation and physical superiority hadn't been enough to ensure his dominance. The idea that this small scholarship student might pose any real threat to him was absurd. "Look at that," Marcus called out to his companions. "I think we made the little girl angry." His voice carried the casual cruelty that had characterized his treatment of Sarah since her arrival at Fort Davidson. He stepped closer, intending to shove her back to the ground and continue the systematic humiliation that Sergeant Hawkins had encouraged. But something in Sarah's expression made him hesitate despite his size advantage and numerical superiority. Sarah's transformation was becoming more apparent with each passing second. The trembling victim who had been cowering in the dirt was gone, replaced by someone whose very stillness suggested coiled violence ready to explode. Her breathing had shifted to the rhythm Miguel had taught her during countless hours in the underground fighting circuits, and her hands had unconsciously formed loose fists that spoke of training far beyond anything the academy provided. Sergeant Hawkins recognized the change even if the cadets didn't. Years of combat experience had taught him to identify genuine threats, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming warnings about the girl he had been systematically tormenting. He began moving toward the group with growing urgency, perhaps finally understanding that his campaign of harassment had awakened something far more dangerous than he had bargained for. "That's enough," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. But his words seemed to have no effect on the confrontation unfolding in front of him. Sarah's attention remained focused on Marcus with laser-like intensity, and the other cadets were too caught up in their anticipated victory to notice their instructor's growing alarm. Marcus reached for Sarah's shoulder, intending to force her back to the ground with the casual brutality that had made him a feared figure among younger cadets. His hand was inches from making contact when Sarah moved with speed that seemed to violate the laws of physics. One moment she was standing passively in front of him, and the next she had seized his wrist in a grip that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting up his arm. The techniques Miguel had taught her in the warehouse district came flooding back with devastating clarity. Sarah's small hands became weapons as she applied pressure to nerve clusters that Marcus didn't even know existed. His confident smile disappeared as agony replaced arrogance, and he found himself completely helpless in the grip of someone he had dismissed as weak and insignificant. "I said get away from me," Sarah repeated, and this time her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had learned violence in places where mistakes meant serious injury or death. Marcus tried to pull away, but her grip was like steel cables wrapped around his wrist. When he attempted to use his free hand to break her hold, she shifted her position with dancer-like grace and applied additional pressure that made him gasp in pain. The other cadets who had participated in the assault stared in shocked disbelief as their leader was systematically disabled by someone they had been tormenting with impunity for months. Sarah's movements were precise and controlled, displaying a level of fighting skill that made mockery of the basic hand-to-hand combat techniques they had learned at the academy. This wasn't the fumbling desperation of someone fighting for survival, this was the calculated violence of someone who had been trained by experts. Sergeant Hawkins was running now, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine fear about what was about to happen. He could see the situation spiraling completely beyond his control as the girl he had deliberately targeted revealed capabilities that transformed her from victim to apex predator in the span of seconds. His carefully orchestrated humiliation was becoming a demonstration of just how badly he had misunderstood the person he was dealing with. Marcus tried to use his size advantage to overpower Sarah's grip, but she anticipated his movements with the prescient clarity of someone who had faced larger opponents countless times before. As he lunged forward, she stepped aside and redirected his momentum, using his own strength against him in a maneuver that sent him stumbling toward the concrete wall of the courtyard. The impact was solid and final, leaving him dazed and struggling to understand how the situation had reversed so completely. Two of Marcus's companions moved to intervene, perhaps finally, understanding that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience or capability. But Sarah was already shifting to meet their advance, her body flowing into defensive positions that spoke of hundreds of hours of training in environments far more dangerous than anything Fort Davidson could provide. The first attacker rushed forward with the clumsy aggression that passed for fighting skill among privileged academy students. Sarah met his charge with a combination of moves that disabled him so quickly that observers barely had time to register what had happened. She used his momentum to throw him into his companion, sending both cadets crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and confusion. The remaining members of the assault team backed away as they finally began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The girl they had been systematically destroying was not the helpless victim they had imagined. She was something far more dangerous. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the heaviest storm inside. Sarah Martinez had spent 3 years enduring every insult, every cruel joke, and every deliberate attempt to break her spirit at Fort Davidson Military Academy. She cleaned up after her tormentors, accepted their mockery with silent dignity, and never once raised her voice in protest. To everyone around her, she was just another weak link in the chain, someone who didn't belong in their elite world of military precision and brutal hierarchy. But what they didn't know was that Sarah had been forged in fires far hotter than anything the academy could offer. Growing up in the underground fighting circuits of East Los Angeles, she had learned that the most dangerous fighters were often the ones who never showed their true strength until the moment it mattered most. She had promised herself she would only use those skills if she had absolutely no other choice. That choice was about to be taken away from her in the most humiliating way possible. What happened next in the academy's training yard would become legend, a single moment that would shatter every assumption, challenge every prejudice, and prove that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who holds all the real power. This is the true story of how one woman's breaking point became her breakthrough, and how a moment of violence became a catalyst for justice that would change an entire institution forever.